Hello, and welcome to our second gender talk of the semester. My name is Dr. M. Shadi Malaklu, and I'm the founder and director of the Bell Hooks Center at Berea College and chair of its Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department. I would like to begin today by acknowledging that our center and college are located on the ancestral homelands of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the Cherokee Nation, the Shawnee Tribe, and the Yuchi. We recognize that their material and spiritual relationships with these lands and waterways precede ours, and that their sovereignty has persisted amidst continued removal. There is no land statement that can sufficiently account for this violence, and so I will not attempt one. What I will say is that we need to do better, and that the Bell Hooks Center invites you to disrupt settler systems of domination with us. The work of decolonization is a communal one. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, Associate Professor of Religious Studies and African American Studies at the University of Virginia and interdisciplinary artist, Dr. Ashon Crawley. Ashon's work in the areas of Black study, queer theory, sound studies, theology, continental philosophy, and performance studies really paves new directions for thinking about identity and difference. His first book, Black Pentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, published by Fordham University Press in 2016, investigates alternative modes of sociality present in the aesthetic practices of Black Pentecostalism. His second book, The Lonely Letters, published by Duke University Press in 2020, explores the relationship between Blackness, quantum mechanics, mysticism, and, as Bell loved to talk about, love. Today's talk, entitled Tales of Musicians, takes its inspiration from Ashon's recent ongoing research and oral history project on the Hammond B3 organ, the Black Church and Sexuality. Dr. Crawley will address the performance of identity and belonging, the practice of community and exclusion, using musicianship with the Hammond organ as the object through which stories can be told. Some fictional, some biographical. These stories are about Blackness, queerness, joy, and love. As Bell Hooks teaches us, there can be no justice without love. We are grateful to be with Ashon today to think deeper about what Hooks describes as, quote, beloved community. Responding to Dr. Crawley's remarks today is Reverend Leonard Curry, Assistant Director of the Anderson Ecumenical Institute at Payne Theological Seminary in Wilberforce, Ohio, and a doctoral candidate in religion at Vanderbilt University. An African Methodist Episcopal Church elder, Leonard holds a Master of Sacred Theology and Master of Divinity from Yale Divinity School, a Master of Arts in Teaching from Christian Brothers University, and a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies from Rhodes College. Reverend Curry's interdisciplinary work, much like Ashon's, explores the themes of modern and contemporary art, constructions of human subjectivity, the relation of shame and interest to identity, the relation of disability, impairment, and ableism to human sexuality, and genealogies of Black sexualities. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the hard work of my colleagues, namely our program associates, including Gender Talk Coordinator and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Major Malaya Wright, and my administrative colleague extraordinaire, Kat Moses, without whom none of what we do would be possible. Additionally, I want to thank Berea College's Office of Diversity and Inclusion, its Department for Studies of Religions and Spiritualities, and its African and African American Studies Department for their generous co-sponsorship of this event. We are grateful to be in conversation and collaboration as we build beloved community in Berea. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ashon Crawley and Reverend Leonard Curry to Berea. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the talk, either through the Q&A function or chat function on the bottom of your Zoom dashboard. We will address your questions at the end. Thank you. Dr. Crawley?
Thank you for that generous introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I really am always humbled to be able to share some of the ongoing curiosities, worries, desires, joys, struggles, and hopes that I have. And I just flew in literally this morning from Boston. And so I am a little bit, I woke up at 4 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to catch the flight. So I'm a little bit mentally frazzled, which is why I'm going to read sort of directly from the document, as opposed to sort of talking extemporaneously, but I do look forward to the Q&A. I will say at the outset that I'm trying to accomplish a couple of things. In this talk, I'm reading from the book in progress that's titled Made Instrument, which is a new history of the Hammond organ as a history of contemporary Black sexuality. And I'll also read a bit from a short story collection in progress that will also be a novel, tentatively titled Between the Sanctuary and the Parking Lot, which is a fictional rendering of musicians that play the Hammond organ for Black churches, and takes place during the same years of the history that I'm sort of documenting in the Made Instrument project. The short section that I'm going to, the very short section I'll read from Between the Sanctuary and the Parking Lot is a section about a 5-year-old boy. At the outset, I'll say that I may cry during the talk. I've been giving different versions of this talk, and I've been trying to write new pieces for each of them so that by the time this book is due, I'll have something close to done. So I was writing last night and this morning on the plane. And often when I'm reading things in that register, I don't know how it's going to impact me. So I just want to say that I may cry during the talk because I'm working through difficult histories. But I'm hoping that we can reckon with some of the difficult history so that we can produce a more just world. They're not just institutional histories of harm and violence, they are also interpersonal refusals, familial abuses, and rejections, practices of self-doubt, castigation of oneself to hell. So if I do cry, I hope that you recognize that it is crying for a world, or if crying in the direction of and with the hope for a world otherwise than this one, a world that is not occasioned on loss, but occasioned on joy. And so from the Made Instrument, a short summary. Made Instrument explores the ways instrumentation and electricity relate to postbellum, urban, and rural Black life, and how the suppression of Black social life is detected in American culture in general. I use Black churches and the infamous Hammond organ, an instrument invented in the 1930s, which Black churches popularized through revival services and radio broadcasts, as the primary object through which the analysis will take place. In Made Instrument, I talk about how Black life is considered from a normative perspective, antithetical to progress, modernity, and the future, how Black life is typically deemed primitive and stuck in the past. Yet in contemporary Black cultural and creative life, the sound of the Hammond organ is the sound of religiosity, spirituality, and the transcendent. From hip hop songs to nationally televised award shows, when a Hammond organ is present, the sound is supposed to announce the concepts of God's and the divine. The sound is supposed to bespeak the presence of the Black church in its affective, emotive, and sensual life and feel. In television shows and films, television shows like P-Valley and anything from Tyler Perry, the Hammond organ is often present, if not in sound, at least with the presence of the cherry wood cabinet. Its audiovisual presence in the popular imaginary means something. This electric instrument, mechanical object, in other words, is imagined to constitute a spiritual community through sound. However, the musician of this object is often imagined in Black popular culture as queer and hypersexualized. And imagining the musician as both queer and hypersexual is an antagonism to the doctrinal and theological convictions of the very spaces from which they emerge. Imagining the musician as queer flouts loudly what Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham records as the respectability politics of the Black church. There's a crisis at the center and heart of contemporary American culture, the crisis of need and desire and want, the crisis of contradiction. American crises can be sensed in race and sexuality intersecting with spiritual practices and religious spaces. Made Instrument is an exploration into the ways stories of America are told regarding religion, gender, race, sexuality, and forms of cultural expression, and how this telling is often an untelling, an erasure of queer life and love. Made Instrument tells the story of the ways the specific performance practices of Black musicianship on the Hammond organ in Black churches is a vestibule, a waiting area, a canal opening toward a general history of contemporary American sexuality. Electric currents move and animate, sometimes shock and hurt. They amplify and enliven, sometimes short circuit and die. French philosopher Michel Foucault famously wrote about the history of the modern concept sexuality. In his writing, he discussed the ways Victorian practices of gender, sex, and ritual confessions of sin to priests became a global and secular process. According to him, we all ritually examine ourselves and variously confess our secrets, our suppressions. And we don't suppress sexuality and talk of sex as much as we find ritually acceptable ways to say it, to tell it, like the confession, like the dream sequence. In this way, he said that we all are Victorians. We all practice the kind of tellings and untellings that they initiate. Made Instrument makes a similar but also a more specific claim. The imagined queerness of the Black church musicians and the choir director too has meaning for the entire community in and outside the church, in and outside the boundaries of Blackness. In Made Instrument, I argue that making the Hammond organist a category of queer Blackness allows, underscores, hallucinates, and ritually rehearses anxieties regarding the always unsettled practices of gender, sex, and sexuality. These musicians are lampooned as comedic, sermonized against as sinful, discarded as hellbound. And using these musicians as the category of queer Blackness, they constitute for their creative genius, while excluding them from the possibility of the acceptable, also gives a new history of labor extraction and exploitation uniquely grounded in Blackness as queerness, presaging contemporary crises of work, contract employment, and the gig economy. Made Instrument meditates on and sits with these urgently interrelated and textured questions in richly interdisciplinary and creative ways. The project is about the ways the practice of Black gospel music forms community, but is also about the ways musicianship is a creative resource for resistance, power, and identity. That the resistance to doctrine and theological positions is imagined in the figure and sign of the musician is important. Not because every musician participates in queer relationships or desires queerness, but because the placement of queerness there means it exists, it unfolds, it flourishes in the cramped spaces and crevices of purported impossibility. It happens in the necessarily felt but often unnoticed sonic atmosphere. You have to have a sense perception for what's already there, genius emerging from the sonic shadows. And that the Hammond organ as electric is too important. The Hammond organ as an electric instrument is the object around which these various and seemingly disparaging or disparate ideas converge. It does not happen, for example, with the piano or the drum kit or with the same intensity. The electric life of the instrument means the sound could be replicable with a kind of repetition across different times within different spaces. I excavate a history of Black musical practice that does not take religion and spirituality as antithetical to genius, culture, and critical thinking. Instead, musicians' performances on the Hammond and Black churches allows me to argue that religious space too is where genius happens and thrives and spreads. Though Black musicianship as a spiritual practice is foundational to American culture, it is typically told as a place that prompts but cannot itself hold, contain, or be virtuosity, critical, or thoughtful. It is told as a place that needs secular refinement and enlightenment before real genius can be achieved. The normative narrative is that the musician leaves the church or the mosque or the temple in order to more fully realize and inhabit their true potential as musician and thinker and thus individual. In this way, religion and spirituality are only ever social technologies to be escaped in order to produce oneself as a modern individual. Made Instrument resists this narrative. This is a heretofore untold story. One might think that the focus on a specific instrument, the Hammond organ, a constrained and narrow project. However, the project thinks with Black ritual and performance, Black spirituality and imagination, Black gender and sexuality. Additionally, emerging from attention to this instrument is also a history of the failures of local, state, and national governance for education and healthcare. I researched music education and its ending in public schools and the failures of public health to discuss the racialized impact of HIV and AIDS in the 1980s, 90s, and early aughts that deeply impacted the musical life of Black churches. The project spans 1935 to 2005, 70 years of performance of and listening to and for the Hammond organ. Beginning in the 1930s with the invention of the Hammond organ, this is a story about migration and movement toward a health crisis that leaves with us grief, shame, because the dead remain with us in unsettled history. So, two stories, one nonfiction, one fiction, both real. Cassettes. This is the nonfiction. You have to imagine what it was like during my early adolescent years, the late 1980s, the early 1990s. We had a VCR and I used it to record and then rewatch all kinds of things. Everything from episodes of Jim and the Holograms that I recorded towards the end of one particular video cassette, so my parents would not know that I was watching a television show for girls. I can still sing the songs. 2 episodes of Bobby Jones gospel music and sermons from local access television stations. Video cassettes helped me figure out what things in music I love. Video cassettes helped me sense for how each of us differently music stays with us and remains and endures. But 2, video cassettes helped me to notice how not everything stayed, remained, and endured. There were disappearances too. And the videos captured that disappearance of sound made flesh, a flesh made instrument. Father, pastor, mother, preacher, brother, musician, me, singer, we attended church almost daily. And we fellowshiped with lots of other churches, both in New Jersey and New York, and though less frequently in other states as well. Members of the Church of God in Christ, the Pentecostal organization, my sense of belonging and temporality and community was felt because there were annual gatherings at our church, annual gatherings at other local churches, and in Memphis, Tennessee, the Church of God in Christ international headquarters. One year, my parents attended the Holy Convocation in November 1991. My brother and I stayed behind in New Jersey. Our Uncle Thomas, my father's brother, kept us for part of the trip. And because New Jersey Public Schools had its annual teachers convention the first week of November, I was able to stay at my uncle's house during the day, both Thursday and Friday of that week. He had a lot of video cassettes from church services, gospel concerts, and live recordings. I watched one particular video of a choir from the Delaware Valley and I was moved. The song about being prepared for a difficult life but enduring. The song about how nice it is to be on the Lord's side. The song about good news. I watched the video over and over again, but not because of the singing. Those 2 days I watched it over and over again because I could not believe what I was witnessing. Something still difficult to name because there still is so much shame. The leader of the choir, its director, was dying and it was apparent. Too young, he had an emaciated body, hair thin and balding, and at times his voice would crack and stretch and leave. I knew he, quote, had AIDS. And I knew too that he was a sinner. I knew that he was very apparently gay. I knew these things about him because it was the early 90s. The video was recorded and released in 1991. And rumors and gossip circulated. Immaterial whispers and hushed conversations were had about the people that were here yesterday, directing the choir, playing the Hammond organ, and leading solos, sometimes all today, and gone quite literally tomorrow. There were so many stories told about so and such, so much so that I was, as a young person, afraid that something in the music was making the men queer and making the men die. The gossip was supposed to protect families, supposedly innocent, from the stigma of a sinful and dying son, grandson, nephew, cousin, or friend. But the silence and the rumors and the gossip intensified the stigma for the musicians, the choir directors, and the singers. It was within this context that I was afraid to become a musician, a choir director, or to really sing in the Black Pentecostal church of my familiar, even though I loved the music, how it moved me and swayed me and made me feel. But I, like so many others, even when I thought it was a gateway to sin, still moved toward the music. I was entranced because though this choir director was there in the flesh of magnetic tape rendering image and sound, it felt like he was already gone. In the middle of the video, during a protracted praise break when the saints are praising, the director said, quote, "The doctor said I would not live. The doctor said I wouldn't make it. I lost all this weight, didn't know what was going to happen. But I want you to know tonight that I give God praise. I want you to know tonight, God is a healer. If you need healing, God is a healer. If you need deliverance, God is a deliverer. Hallelujah, hallelujah. And I tell you this is for real. We not playing church. We may not live how you want us to live, but we love God. And this is a time that we need to stop playing church and just let God have his way. End quote. By 1992, the next year, the choir director died. The next section. I did not remember the words of the choir director from the 1991 recording as I began to write, but I remembered the repetition and the rewatching, the awe and the disbelief. I hadn't watched the video as an adult for at least 25 years, though I could easily recall how it felt. The musician, the choir director left an impression on me, an immaterial mark and touch, and some sadness too. So seeing his flesh speak those words about weight loss and incredulous doctors and God's healing power stunned me, made me remember. Because the kinds of people that were disappearing were the kinds of people I knew I had an affinity with, even though I did not want to be like them, like that, because the church said that they were sinners and an abomination. Perhaps I was those things too. At 12 years old, I was afraid that the Delaware Valley Choir director's fate would be my fate too. And there were so many others I knew and did not know that were dying too. Writing about this specific patch of land of approximately 2,000 square miles, journalist Rhonda Graham in 1994 stated, quote, "Since 1991, at least 14 singers and musicians have died between Middletown and Philadelphia, a regional circuit for gospel musicians. In Kent County, about 10 singers and musicians in civilian choirs and churches have died since 1990. A small music community in 4 years lost 24 performers, folks that were active in their churches, folks that were friends of people, folks that had family. How do the ones integral to a life get disappeared?" On the 1992 album cover of this Delaware Valley Choir, an image of the now deceased choir director hovers over the choir. The image's opacity is at maybe 60%, such that you can see quite literally through him, his flesh now porous, ghostly. From the 1992 album, I, as a 12-year-old, often listened to, with intention and fear, a song about being thankful for God's mercy. The song is a long-form lament regarding the various things the person, as the soloist, did wrong in their life, but also about how they needed to be a better person and change their behavior. But what did this mean to me as a 12-year-old who was at the time terrifyingly, really, experiencing attractions that were uncontainable and unexplainable and undeniable, experimental and exploratory? I listened on my Walkman to the cassette with the song about mercy over and over again, because I hoped I would not die with thoughts of a boy in my head and with hopes that I would not die like the choir director did. How to tell the story that needs to be told but struggles being told precisely because it is not easy to tell. How many is it? This is a question that is often posed to me when I begin discussing the massive loss that Black churches endured due to the AIDS epidemic during this time. Asked by some because there is a general disbelief in the fact that there was this kind of loss in the first place. Asked by others because the loss for them doesn't mean anything meaningful. And asked by others because they think I'm making it up. What to do about the fact that it is not quantified and that the lack of quantification is itself the evidence of ghosting and silencing. Though the loss of the life of even one is incalculable, I'm not just talking about the loss of a singular individual. I'm talking about the heartbreak that emerges from the loss of a person that is a site of connection, someone that laughed and joked and had heartbreak, someone that had a cousin or a nephew or a son or a grandson, someone that went to diners after midnight musicals, but also the heartbreak that emerges from attending to the loss of the sounds they made and the music they could have but did not create because they did not remain. I'm trying to tell the difficult story and how the difficult story feels. I'm trying to hear the sounds of what they could have done had they lived and been cared for. I have wondered if not saying the names of musicians and singers and choir directors protects them from an ableist world, or if not saying their names reproduces the violence they endured and made music in and through. I've wondered about YouTube and message board comments that often have questions like, Does anyone know how this person died? And people responding with answers like HIV or AIDS, or, he didn't die of kidney failure. It was AIDS, or he was a homosexual. What you think? And the YouTube and message boards being one of the only places where this conversation is even taking place. I've wondered, do I write about the friends and the family that lost family members, cousins, nephews, uncles, brothers, friends, and lovers that I've contacted, but find the loss so difficult even 15, 20, and 30 years later, that it is almost impossible for them to discuss. I've wondered too, do I tell you about the many forms of queer antagonism I currently experience when trying to discuss with musicians the relationship of queerness to the Black church and the Hammond organ? Do I tell people about the scriptural responses that I receive when I talk about homophobia, or the musicians that desperately try to distance themselves from queerness, saying things like, I'm not gay, or, I'm not like that, or, Satan was the chief musician and the leader of the choir in heaven, so it doesn't surprise me that homosexuals are being led to hell too. All of these are deflections. I've wondered, do I write about the musician that in the late 1980s was told not to touch the organ keys after a certain musician touched the Hammond organ because, quote, he sweats a lot and he's sick? The dead are unsettled and remain with us remain with us and endure because they experience casual violence of dismissal and distance and general unkindness. Many of these musicians died alone. Family, friends, and church members were afraid and refused to see or visit them, the very ones that provided for them music, an occasion for praise, and a soundtrack for worship. These musicians haunt because the fullness of their stories have not been told, the fullness of their life worlds, their experiences, their loves, and their sadnesses have not been given breaths and thus have not been given rest. These musicians haunt because they have not been given proper ceremony, because in lacking proper ceremony, they have not been severed from this world. They remain with us in unsettled history. I'm trying to tell the story that needs to be told, but it's difficult to tell. Third section of this. We had to have taken Route 87 north, because that is the route one would have taken to get from East Orange, New Jersey to Quebec City. I was in junior high school, my second year in the 8th grade. I was in the junior high school band, played the drums, though I mostly hated the exercises and didn't like practicing. I wasn't much good at it, but I was trying to learn to be made instrument for our church. I sold katydids for the school fundraiser. Mr. Patuto, our band teacher, wanted us to experience the world with a bus trip to Canada. I don't recall much of the trip, some very immature early teen jokes with me and my roommates, my ordering mugu gai pan from a Chinese restaurant in Canada and folks laughing at it, even though it tasted good, and the cassettes. I'd gotten the Sony Walkman for Christmas, maybe the year previous, and I took it everywhere with me. My friend Edward went to another Black Pentecostal church in East Orange, though they were oneness and not Trinitarian. So my then 13-year-old self very likely would have thought that they weren't saved for real. But he let me borrow 2 cassettes and I listened to them incessantly, those 7 hours going and 8 hours returning home. Both were Ronald Winans' Family and Friends Choir, Volumes 3 and Volumes 2. The order, the 3 and then the 2, is important because I listened to the former first. The cover featuring a photo of a dark-skinned and beautiful Ronald in a deep purple suit jacket, a lavender shirt, head tilted and a shy smile. A simple cover, the photo framed with a kind of lilac lavender on one side, a kind of soft orange on the other. It was enough for me to listen. You Don't Know was a particularly moving song for me, a funky rhythmic song with Dorinda Clark Cole on the lead. A Song of Consecration, too, with Ronald and his brother Marvin trading on the lead, was beautifully inspiring to me. Lyrics, asking questions like I've never asked before, expecting answers that will unlock every door to a new and living way. To serve you better in the future is the only reason I'm here today. Seeking God in a very solemn way, taking heed to the things I do and say, offering myself to Him. I'm coming as a brother, I'm coming as a friend. And the chorus, oh, now I see it's you I need, and with your help, deny myself. put my hand in yours, end quote. You have to imagine a 13-year-old Black boy with a strong sense of the spiritual, a deep desire to be holy and sanctified, a hope for a clean future, hearing these words, listening to them over and listening to them over and over again. Because the 13-year-old Black boy kept feeling things that he knew he would need to deny. And because the 13-year-old Black boy kept feeling things that he knew he would have to deny of and in himself in order to have a personal relationship with Jesus. It's as if the song named a longing, but also an action the boy would have to undergo, full and complete denial of desire and joy that he'd feel as the butterflies in his stomach whenever he thought of that one boy or that other boy. Such delightfulness led to so many tears. He kept rewinding and rewinding and rewinding and listening again and again. Maybe he could slip into the song, maybe inhabit it, but maybe the friend that asked for the tape, and exchanged that tape for the volume 2. I liked this volume 2 more because it felt more churchy. There were the sounds of the Hammond organ much more pronounced and felt warm. This volume 2 was released 2 years previous in 1989. And the person that played the Hammond organ for her sisters in Detroit for another famous gospel album, Twinkie Clark, which I talk about in a different chapter, sang with this famous Detroit gospel family on the Volume 2 album in a song titled "The Word of God." In the reprise, I'm going to play it for you so you can hear. Share screen.
Isn't it funny how we've all changed? I love this part. I love this part. Why, I remember if you weren't holy in the choir, you couldn't sing. But now we go for almost anything. Oh, yeah. We've changed. Can I do the other part? Why, I can even remember when women were women. Uh-oh. Men were men. And now you can't hardly, you can't hardly, you can't hardly tell a her from a him.
Stop there. She sang, I'm just going to repeat the lyrics. Oh, isn't it funny how how we've all changed? I remember if you were not holy in the choir, you couldn't sing, but now we go for almost anything. Oh, y'all, we've changed. I can even remember when women were women. Uh-oh. Then she laughs, and then they laugh. And men were men. And now you can't hardly tell a her from a him. Oh, y'all, we've changed. You have to imagine, again, a 13-year-old Black boy with a strong sense of the spiritual, a deep desire to be holy and sanctified, a hope for a clean future, hearing these words and listening to them over and over again. Because that 13-year-old Black boy kept feeling things that he knew he'd have to deny of and in himself in order to have a personal relationship with Jesus. I thought it was 35 minutes, so sorry. Yeah. He felt something of the holy that he did that he wanted to be, but was not because of doctrine, because of his shameful and unspoken sin. His desire that he did not ask for, but certainly emerged as an ongoing uncertainty. It's as if the song named a longing that he would have to denounce, a conflation of gender and sexuality and not living up to the role God desired, a role that God required. A song that even with laughter had a 13-year-old Black boy consider what he would have to undergo, a full and complete denial of desire and joy that he feel as butterflies in his stomach whenever he thought of the one boy or that other boy. Such delightfulness led to so many tears. Recorded in Detroit, this song documents the shadow of displacements and violence. Because what is happening in Detroit in the 1980s and the 1990s for such a bold claim of failure to live the correct gendered position to be happening? Why did these lyrics produce laughter instead of the ethical crisis? Twinkie's laughter veiled and hid from view the refusal to contend with the presence of difference and what the presence of difference meant for the whole of community. Because there was supposedly a time when women were women and men were men, but now you can't hardly tell a her from a him. But what's happening in Detroit in 1989, the same year that this album is released, is that there are 503 HIV diagnoses in Detroit, 175 deaths and 302 AIDS diagnoses and 167 deaths. Approximately 27% of the new diagnoses are Black folks. The laughter of the queen of the Hammond B3, Twinkie Clark, enunciated the abandonment of the community to the interior life of Black folks. I'm trying to write a love letter. I'm trying to write a letter about what would happen if we would contend with and care for the people who should be cared for, but were abandoned when they should not have been abandoned. And then I'll just read this quick section. Little Kenny. This is fiction. Well, I heard he cried more than anybody else. He knew his numbers and his letters, his shapes and his colors. He knew Mom's name was Rosalie and his mother's name was Janet, which she changed to Khadijah, then back to Janet. He knew his Uncle Jamal, who just died, was his mother's twin brother, though he really didn't understand what twin meant. She'd say, we were born at the same time on the same day, though I was born first, and chuckle a bit whenever she'd visit. And she visited more those final days. He knew he was 5 years old and could count it out on his fingers, hold up his hand excitedly with all the digits extended. He knew a lot of things for a kid, but he didn't know what passed away meant. And he didn't know what that tone meant when he heard it, even though he'd heard that tone before. Like the times when there was a quiet talk about his mother. I just never thought Janet would get caught up in all that mess. Like the times Janet would appear at the school, the random days she'd show up to take him home early. He'd ask her, why you got your hair like that? Or, we did numbers today. Or, can we get McDonald's? But he really was just happy to be with her for a little bit, though he wouldn't have known how to say it even if he could. And he'd cry and cry and cry whenever she left. Like the times Mom would talk to his father's mother. They lived around the corner, but he barely ever saw him. He was caught up in it too. Like the times when there was talk about Uncle Jamal's friend. He liked the word friend. His best friend was Jeffrey, though he didn't really know what it meant either. They'd play cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, and Dorney Park, which mostly consisted of them throwing each other around and pounding into each other like they'd seen on the rides too big for them at the amusement park. He thought about Jeffrey whenever Mom and her friends talked about Jamal's friend, but he had friends and he didn't understand why their voices would do that thing that they do when talking about Jamal's. He hoped they shared toys and maybe played the Dorney Park too. And he heard those words. Well, I heard he cried more than anybody else because it was a funeral. He knew it was about the man, Elder Johnson, that was supposed to sing but cried instead. Others shouted, and so little Kenny shouted and bounced too. He played church with Jeffrey, and sometimes they whispered to each other about the people that were passing away, but no one would tell them why. It was a funeral, and so people were sad, and because Uncle Jamal always took him to church, Until he became too sick to go himself, he'd been to lots of funerals in his 5 short years. And he'd seen many of Uncle's friends from the choir die and laying in caskets. Are they in heaven? Yes, baby. Uncle Jamal was little Kenny's barber too. And he liked Uncle Jamal because he treated him like a grown-up, asked him serious questions about colors and shapes in Sesame Street. You like Oscar the Grouch more than Cookie Monster? Don't tell my mom, but I do too. He knew that funerals were times when people cried. He'd seen his uncle cry so much, lose himself in tears, but he'd still be on the organ, would sit little Kenny right next to him most times as he played through the pain. And so he, little Kenny, understood that funerals were places where people cried. It wasn't his first funeral. It was the early 1990s and it was happening all the time, but he could not figure out what that tone matched with those words at a funeral was about that was used to typically talk about his mother. And so he was curious about it. What did the tone mean? And why was it uttered? And sure, it was just that his uncle had died, but he hoped that he would wake up too. Did any of them wake up? Will you see Uncle Jamal again, Mommy? Janet just cried. Jamal was a well-known musician in Philadelphia. People sought after him for his skill, for the way he directed the youth choir that had everyone from the age of 5 to 20 in it. And he was very well known in the city for the choir too. I will end there. Thank you for allowing me to share some of my work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crawley, for that beautifully queer critique and vulnerable fabulation. Thank you. Reverend Curry, we're so excited to be in conversation with you as well. Thank you for your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I thought I would give you all a churchy introduction. So first, giving honor to God, who is the head of my life, or I rewrote also on my notes. First, giving honor to the gods who head my life, and to Dr. M. Shadi Malaklu, the angel of this house. Isn't she doing fantastic work? Chair and Assistant Director of the Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies program or department, excuse me, and the inaugural Director of the Bell Hooks Center, and recently tenured member of the faculty. And to the scholar of the hour, Dr. Ashon Crawley, a brilliant mind and beautiful spirit and thinker of otherwise possibilities. What a word on today. Now, if you are familiar with the aesthetics of the Black church, not necessarily Black Pentecostal aesthetics, but as a Black aesthetic, perhaps Ashon might argue that they are Black Pentecostal aesthetics, then you know a little something about the form of my opening remarks, right? Theme and variation. A musician, a scholar of sound physics, faith, and religion, Dr. Crawley has presented us with a profound offering of sight and sound sensing, stories, intuitions, imagination, re-narration and redescription of things, very painful, but a consideration of pain to ask us how we might be together and together for each other differently. Dr. Crawley has written elsewhere that perhaps what we're looking for is relation. So I'll quote him because I think that it's apropos of what he shared today. He says, perhaps what we are looking for is relation as a mode of existence that white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, relation as a mode of existence that Western thought, theological, philosophical, historical, ethical attempts to dispense with, to discard, to destroy as its foundational project. And I think that today, in a moving meditation, Dr. Crawley has demonstrated to us that the relation that we're also after is even a relationship with the dead, right? With those who have gone on before, with the ancestors, with people whom we have loved or have come to love, have known, have felt, have sensed, who are with us in body and who are no longer with us in body, but perhaps are present with us in spirit. The title of this talk was Tales of Musicians. And since Dr. Crawley and I share so much of an itinerary in terms of what we think about and where our hearts are, even being a young person who was spiritually intuitive, connected, if you will, and not sure about the church because of the church's stance on our sexuality, I wanted to share a story, a tale of my own. I was once a student of Dr. Hortense Spillers. Yes, the Dr. Hortense Spillers. Uh, that sounds grand, right? Doesn't it? But the truth of the matter is more like I was a bump on the log, doing my best to keep up in that class. And she was a sculptor every week, taking the hammer of the souls of Black folk and the chisel of her sharp and precise diction to articulate the brilliance of her vision with respect to and on our social flesh. She left an impression on me, not least of all because of the way that she would get out of her winter coat. It was Nashville and it was 2015, January or February. Well, of course, January and then February, and it was cold. And Dr. Spillers would come in in a large puffy coat. And if we were together in person, I would perform this for you, but just imagine, just follow along in a large puffy coat. And then to rid herself of her outerwear, she would basically shimmy out of her coat. She would undo the top few buttons enough to free her arms and shoulders, and then she would shimmy her coat on down until it fell around her ankles, and on the floor, she would step or was able to step out of the coat. In this talk today, Dr. Crawley talked about the use of rumor to question why queerness and the queerness of the community is shed, is sloughed off like an ill-fitting coat. Are Black people, are Black queer people, the floor for the Black community's excess? For Black religious persons' queerness? Do Black queer people become a subordinated yet nonetheless fecund site for productivity, inspiration, or production? What metaphor is superlative here? Should we think about Black queer people as the soil, as the salt, right? As the silt of the earth, a place where you bury things, where things can be shed and left, but also a place where you turn again and again for the production of new life. I wonder, to what degree is this about differentiation? And I know that we're running out of time, so I'll say a couple more things in my remarks here. And Dr. Crawley, I would love to hear you say something about this. I know that you are a thinker of relation and otherwise possibilities, but I've been reading Eve Sedgwick, maybe because you were reading Eve Sedgwick, and I noticed that in the essay, Shame in the Cybernetic Fold, she talks about the moment of systems theory and the way that difference is maybe the effect of a process of differentiation. She says on page 12, or Sylvan Tompkins or rather Adam Frank and Eve Sedgwick say on page 12, that the prospect of virtually unlimited computational power gave a new appeal to concepts such as feedback, which had been instrumentally available in mechanical design for over a century, but which, if understood as a continuing feature of many systems, including the biological, would have introduced a quite unassimilable level of complexity to descriptive or predictive calculations. Between the time it was unthinkable to essay such calculations and time when it became commonplace to perform them, there intervened a period when they were available to be richly imagined, but they were still imagined with a structural elegance, an interest in conceptual economy of means and modeling that were not destined to survive the introduction of the actual technology. And then they follow that up on page 22, and it says, without positive affect, there can be no shame. Only a scene that offers you enjoyment or engages your interest can make you blush. And if I move on down to the end of the paragraph, they quote Anthony Wilden, who says, in order for a system to be open to an environment, the system must be capable of punctuating itself as distinct from that environment as to select messages within it. I think if your project is really a project of the production of a contemporary understanding of Black sexuality, then to some degree, you just gave us the linchpin for that production. at least as it regards Black community. We may not like the ethics of it, but it seems as if Black people are producing a sexuality through differentiation by sloughing off queerness. I want to say finally, as a person who's been a pastor, your attempt to love people and to grieve them publicly is a radical act. So thank you for sharing those stories with us today. Those are my remarks. I turn it back into your hands, Dr. Malaklu. Thank you, Dr. Crawley, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you so much, Reverend Curry. We have a few minutes for questions, and I do encourage you to please use the Q&A or chat function on your dashboard to ask questions of our esteemed guests today.
And I'll just say really quickly, while question, I hadn't even thought of the Eve Sedgwick piece because I've been thinking about renunciation as the practice of producing queerness, not as identity, but as a leaving behind the possibility for queer relationality as the thing that actually produces queerness as it is, that people refuse it. And so I'll return to that piece because I think that that is actually the same sort of function and form that I'm actually interested in, the sort of production of uniqueness, the production of a kind of core stability that is produced over and against the thing that it's trying to leave behind. And the thing that is sort of left behind then gets marked as the difference when it's actually the ones who have left it, who are trying to produce difference so that they don't have to be supposedly like that. So thank you for that. That's really helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Crawley. Please do ask questions. I see some of you attendees, and I know you have some questions to ask, including some of my students, so please don't be shy.
It's okay to be shy too. I'm shy, very shy and introverted, so I get it.
I can ask a question if that's all right.
Sure.
I'm really, really moved by the ways in which your scholarship thinks about sound and movement, kind of a reorientation of the senses that becomes possible through a queer Black radical critique. And I think often about, I'm a Fanonian scholar, and I think about the ways in which Fanon talks about the incredible psychic pain, cognitive dissonance, and hypervigilance of even doing something as simple, he says, as reaching over for his cigarettes on the nightstand. And he describes this with pain. And I'm thinking about the critical fabulation that you offer. And I'm wondering what that can do to reorient our senses. What does it mean to see for touch and to feel for movement, for example?
I thank you for that. I think that what I'm trying to do is within the writing produce an occasion of disorientation, to make the sense experiences mixed up, because I'm trying to approach something like what it would have felt like. So I'm writing about a 5-year-old, I'm writing about a 15-year-old, and then I'm writing about these adults too. One of the people's going to be, I think he's like around 65 years old. But like, I'm trying to write about these different age moments and like what that sensory perception would be and how they would actually try to register what's actually happening. And I'm doing it in this way to ground it in sense perception, because I think that is where this is mostly felt. It's not cognitive, or it's not a sort of mode of cognition that is aside from or separated from sense perception, but it is a mode of cognition that is fully encaptured by our sensual capacity. And so I'm trying to mess with them, because I think that what is actually happening for people who are experiencing these moments is a real disorientation. And so can the writing approach something like the disorientation that people are actually experiencing, while also trying to orient the reader in disorientation without allowing the reader to get lost in the disorientations? And so it's a real sort of slow attempt to figure out like what is the right method for illustrating the difficulty of these sort of moments in the early 90s, in the late 80s and the early 90s. And it can one render that in a way that both the reader gets a sense for how disorienting it is without the reader being this. I want the reader to feel the disorientation without the reader being disoriented. And so trying to write through that is like the attempt that I'm trying to do. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crawley. I know you have to go, but if you have time for one more question, we might
Yeah.
entertain that. So Malaya, a WGS major, asks, with your talk in mind, can the Black church still be a place of queer Black futurity? Should we shift our gazes elsewhere?
Well, that's complicated. I mean, thank you for that question, Malay. I think that it's complicated. Um, I think the problem is that fundamentalism, that one of the issues that I am sort of sensing is the history of a kind of radical politic that produces the thing called the Black church and its differentiation and variance, is often used in a historical way to justify the contemporary practices, as if the contemporary practice is always radical in terms of its thinking and practice because of the history that produced it as a radical sort of response to and antagonism to white supremacy. That it's like, oh, we were radical in the past, so we must be currently too. And so our ideas about gender, sex, and sexuality must be right. It's like, no, that's like radicality is a practice that you have to commit to ongoingly. And so, but that also then means that, you know, there is no institution that is not vulnerable to the same kind of production of fundamentalism, such that they can point to a past and say, well, we were radical in the past, and so we don't have to actually care about the things that we're saying or doing to people today. And so I think that on the one hand, the church could become a place where Black queer futurity is practiced, but I think what it would need to do is actually go back to like you would have to go backwards, and you would have to rediscover things about yourself that have been relinquished or let go of or renounced in the service of becoming normal or being integrated into civil society. You know, there was a time when Pentecostals were pacifists, and like the founder of the Church of God in Christ was arrested and jailed because he was preaching against, you know, World War I, and he said we shouldn't be fighting wars. Like, that's not what God calls us to do. And now there's like this huge celebration of people who are part of military and like being decorated in the military because the ideas that we were excluded from it in the past. And so now that we're included in it, it must be a good thing. And it's like, no, we actually have to rediscover a kind of critical stance against domination and practices of power and authority, the rulers of darkness that are in high places, like this kind of ideology. And so the Black church could do that, but it would have to do some real reckoning. And I think one of the intense places of reckoning is with what happened in the 80s and the 90s, with allowing these musicians to die and not commenting on it, but like the ratcheting up of sermons about the sins of homosexuality and the sermons that are castigating people and telling them that, you know, this is, you know, punishment for, you know, your sinful behavior, or the refusal to talk about the queerness of these musicians, or the refusal to give them real funerals, or the funerals that were had for these musicians and choir directors that literally weren't about them at all, but about their parents or their family trying to save face and say, we're a respectable family, and we, you know, we won't even mention like the fact that this person was sick. We won't even talk about this person really. We're just doing this thing because the public expects it. There were so many different ways, in other words, that this is a microcosm of a certain kind of practice of unkindness. And I think that what has to happen is a reckoning with that unkindness so that we could rediscover some of the things that were actually being produced in these moments that were joyful, that were loving, that were kind. And so, you know, we can look elsewhere, but we should also still be willing to interrogate the space where this is still happening. Black folks are still contracting HIV at alarming and disproportionate rates, and increasing rates today. And so because we haven't collectively dealt with the theological and doctrinal foundations upon which the idea of the sinfulness of the person who contracts HIV exists, we still are actually in that epistemological moment. That rapper, Little Baby, I think his name is, Lil Baby or The Baby, who has said that, stuff about HIV and AIDS last year and about queer people last year. That is a part of this entire epistemological moment where we still think that collectively that HIV is something to be ashamed of, that a virus is something to be ashamed of. And so it's not just church, right? It's also hip hop concerts. So we can't look to anywhere that has gotten it right. We have to be willing to interrogate all these places. The church has just done a really bad job of attempting to overcome that and to really, apologize for it, say sorry, things like that. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crawley. I know we need to let you go, so please sign off at your leisure. Thank you so much, Dr. Crawley. Much appreciation.
I really appreciate you all. And it was a joy to share. I haven't shared some of this at all. So it was a joy to be able to share some of it with you all. And thank you, Reverend Curry, for your response. I really do appreciate the generous and charitable engagement. So,
absolutely. It was great to be here with you.
You all have a great day.
Thank you, Dr. Crawley.
Bye.
Reverend Curry, I wanted to ask if you might have any responses to Malaya's question before we sign off.
Yeah, I think, and I want to be sensitive to Malaya's question and also to try to internalize the response that Dr. Crawley just gave. But I do think that I'm going to make a general statement and then try to weave it in back to the church. I do think that sometimes it's easy for us as African Americans, or I won't even say that. Walk with me here. Walk with me, church. Walk with me, children. As an African American, you have one of the first things you have to do, and I know this is gendered, so just stick with me, is you have to develop an analysis for race. You have to understand how race is operative within this country. If you don't, it only hurts you. It only works in your disservice, in the opposite of your favor. And for many of us, especially for Black men, that becomes our only work. If you're a Black cisgendered man, then the only thing you do is you learn how racism works, and you learn how anti-Black racism works, and that's the end. You get an understanding of white supremacism, and you got a weapon in your tool bag, and that's great. The church has often been a site, the Black church in particular has often been a site or place where that was the first and the last analysis, particularly because of the way that it works with gender, or the way that gender has been represented within the church. Structurally and historically, there has been a subordination of women to men in the Black church. And so the primary or the predominant analysis has been one of racism, race and racism, white supremacism. If the church really deeply dove into questions of gender and sexuality, I think that we might open up into and onto what Ashon calls otherwise possibilities. And then I'll say, again, another general statement, because of the optics, the spectacularity, the specularity of Black bodies in this country, when Black people argue with one another, when they disagree, it's often looked at as, pardon my French, I'm not going to say it, an infight, right? It's looked at as an inward fight, right? Which is this old thing that literally happened during enslavement, where master slave owners would pit Black men against other Black men and make them fight for their entertainment, right? So that's a literal thing. When Black people disagree in public, because of our inability to control the aesthetics of how the Black image shows up, it carries the valence of this inward fight over and over again. What that does to Black discourses then is that it often evacuates it of power. Esau McCaulley just wrote a book called Reading the Bible While Black. He talks about this. I mean, several people speak to this. It is very difficult for Black people to have robust conversations in the public sphere because of the way that the optics around Black bodies and Black life are controlled by white supremacist gazes. So that means that our ethics are often lacking. That's the short story, Malaya. our ethics are lacking because we don't get to have the robust, needed conversations because of the way that that we are viewed and seen in public. So all of our institutions, all of the institutions which we control, and all of the institutions in which we are a part, we have to fight on multiple levels, on multiple fronts, and we need a sort of to double down or recommit to ethical possibility. That's interior, right? Interior to Blackness.
Thank you, Reverend Curry. And of course, this resonates with Bell's love ethic. So in the spirit of a love ethic and of the ethics you implore us to incorporate into our lives, I want to thank everyone for attending today. I want to thank Dr. Crawley and Reverend Curry again for joining us. And I want to encourage you to tune in person, actually, to visit us at the Bell Hooks Center for our next gender talk on April 13th with Disability Studies scholar Gina Kim. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful, wonderful Wednesday.